I've heard it said that the most common era for someone to recreate on a model railroad is the years they grew up in, which is part of the reason why we see so many retirees in the present day modeling the 1950s and 60s. I believe it is also why you sometimes encounter 30-year-olds who collect models of trains from the 1990s. In either case, or anyone's case really, the models can take you back to a happier and simpler time. Don't get me wrong, I'm not claiming that people only model their childhood, but I am saying that it appears to be common, and I have even caught myself doing it to a degree. In this video, I will go over 10 model trains I acquired because they tie into some part of my past. Growing up in the late 1990s, I watched quite a few Railroad VHS tapes. It wasn't just Thomas the Tank Engine, we had a VHS tape collection of old Railroad promotional films as well. One of these was Last of the Giants, a Union Pacific publicity film about their big boy locomotives. I am surprised that I did not wear that tape out. When I was taken to model railroad displays around age 4 or 5, I wanted to see a big boy. I vaguely remember spouting big boy facts at classmates in kindergarten, which in hindsight was probably a bad sign. Regardless, when I entered the HO world, a big boy made the list of locomotives I wanted, primarily because of those formative years. It wasn't immediate, but I did eventually get one. Another VHS tape that I just about wore out was part of a series created by Dave Hood. The series had many entrants. There goes a boat, there goes an airplane, there goes a fire truck, and the one I remember most, there goes a train. That video was my introduction to the Amtrak Genesis, as Dave nearly backed one into the Redondo Beach turntable pit. Many older rail fans see the General Electric P40s and P42s as butt ugly. They're beautiful to me. Not only did I see them on that VHS tape growing up, but occasionally, if I was lucky, I would see them go through Brunswick, Maryland watching trains some evenings with my dad. If a big boy was the first thing I hoped to see at a model display, a Genesis was number 2. Needless to say, I have a few models of these locomotives now. In 2001, my grandfather purchased a copy of Microsoft Train Simulator for me. This was shortly after the game was originally released. MSTS, as it came to be known, included 2 American, 2 European, and 2 Japanese routes. Some of you may have seen my older MSTS nostalgia videos, so it would come as no surprise that I played the game a great deal. The default trains in MSTS became an indelible part of my childhood. I set out some years ago to acquire models of some of the trains featured, which is part of the reason why I got into British models, and by extension is part of the reason Tea and Moonshine came to be. At present, I have Flying Scotsman from the Settle and Carlisle route, the GP38 from Marias Pass, and a set of Orient Express coaches from the Innsbruck-Saint Anton route. I have long-term eyes on an HO scale model of BNSF 4723, as well as a Sella stock. Regardless, the trains of MSTS are another piece of my childhood returned in model form. During the evening train-watching sessions in Brunswick, Maryland, there were a few things I could be almost certain of seeing. There were always the MARC commuter trains, and just as reliably there would be a single-stack container train riding a restricted signal eastbound through West Brunswick. Almost invariably, the train was led by a single GE AC6000 diesel locomotive. The massive rear radiator is the feature by which you can pick an AC6000 out instantly, and I still remember the vision clearly. In 2017, when I finally got into HO-scale model railroading, an AC6000 was high on my list. I purchased one from Broadway Limited Imports' refurb section as my 3rd or 4th HO engine, and she's still with me today. It was several years before I had the equipment to recreate the single-stack train, but I have it now. A couple years ago, another club member offered to have Loc Sound installed in the model as a Christmas gift. The locomotive runs perfectly fine with my other CSX stock now, and can still bring back those memories of sitting trackside in the early 2000s. Over the years, I have had numerous interests and mild fixations as locomotives go. In elementary school, my grandfather, who had spent his life in the radio industry, recalled his experience repairing a tube radio in the nose of a GG1 locomotive. He then introduced me to the locomotives, and I really took a shine to them. The locomotives were featured in Train's Railroad Simulator 2004, and I made good use of them there. My grandfather gave me a pair of AHM GG1s and a set of PRR passenger cars as a birthday gift one year, and those became some of my best-running HO scale models prior to my getting seriously involved in HO scale, which is a story I will have to tell in another video someday. Regardless, I did acquire a Bachmann DCC and Sound GG1 not too long ago, and it fits happily in that memory of childhood. Every now and then I would come across something in a railroad magazine that piqued my interest. Such was the case of seeing Faro Equus 2100 in Railfan and Railroad magazine in the early 2000s. It doesn't take much to make an impression on a young mind. The photos left a mark, and in later years I learned more about the story of Reading 2100. While railfans now look back at that era of the locomotive's history with skepticism, the aesthetic is still deep in my memories, and is one of the reasons why, when a BLI Paragon 2 model of the engine in Faro Equus paint popped up on eBay, I jumped on it. Likewise, another locomotive introduced to me in a magazine was the Empress, Canadian Pacific 2816. A spread in Railfan and Railroad magazine recalled the restoration and excursion career of the locomotive up to that point. That was my introduction to the locomotive, and I was smitten. It's hard to say exactly what it is, but she's just an overall beautiful locomotive to me. Growing up, I tried my hand at sketching trains. I was never good at it, but 2816 was a common subject. When Rapido Trains announced they were making the Empress in HO scale, my wallet was very much in jeopardy. Still, I now have a model of a locomotive that in many ways I grew up with, despite never seeing her in person. Another locomotive I grew up with but knew little about was a rusted hulk sitting out back of the Strasburg Railroad's shops. We did family day trips up to the railroad a couple times a year as I grew up. During the first part of the ride, I always saw this locomotive, but I didn't know what it was. Years later, when I began to look up steam locomotive databases online, I found out her number was 972, and that she used to run in excursion service. I learned little bits and pieces about her over the years. I learned she was a Canadian Pacific D10 class locomotive, and that she was considered a long-term project at Strasburg. The fascination with the engine was enough for me to pre-order an undecorated D10 from Rapido Trains and plan to letter it up as 972. The model remained undecorated for some time, appearing that way in tea and moonshine, before I drew up a set of decals and lettered it. I wanted to do a video about the life and times of the engine and started researching it, only to find I couldn't tell her story without also telling the story of her former owner, George Hart. That resulted in A Man and His Machine, George Hart and 972. Looking back, it is amazing how not only a dismantled steam locomotive left an impact on me, but her former owner's work also left a big imprint on my childhood without my ever knowing it. As I progressed into my early teen years, a different Pennsylvania Railroad locomotive started to catch my fancy. This was the K4 Pacific steam locomotive. It's hard to say exactly what it was about the engines, but they started to appeal to me. I even looked at getting a DC Bachmann K4 to go with the AHM GG1s and passenger set. I recall being extraordinarily excited when I got a laptop that could run Railworks, today's Train Sim Classic, and could run the K4 over Horseshoe Curve in that game. I genuinely have no idea how many times I did that, but if it exceeds 100, I would not be surprised at all. Naturally, I got a K4 fairly early on once I started pursuing HO-scale model railroading seriously. When Scale Trains announced they were releasing CSX AC4400 diesel locomotives in the YN2 paint scheme, they got a pre-order from me. This was only a few years ago, but the AC44, or as CSX likes to call it, the CW44AC, was second only to the AC6000 in being the definitive locomotives from the train-watching evenings in Brunswick. The AC-44 became CSX's go-to freight locomotives before the Evolution series, commonly called GVOs, became more widespread. Naturally, a pair of AC-44s became part of my collection and are among those models that can remind me of a simpler time. In some ways, these engines bring me full circle, right back to memories of watching CSX trains in the late 90s and early 2000s. When I first sketched out my plan for this video, I penciled in a typical "so there you have it" ending. The more I looked at the models as I filmed for this, however, I started to realize what I have here isn't just a look at my own past, but a cross-section of connections that can later influence what one models. In some cases, I model it because I saw the trains myself. In other cases, it is because I read about the trains or otherwise saw them in photos or print and took interest. You don't have to model the trains you grew up watching for your interest to have sprung from childhood. Anything that caught your fancy early can stay with you for life. That is how lifelong passions begin, and from that passion, many of the most amazing models and layouts spring. It's a beautiful thing. Let's compare notes. If there is a model or models you have because of a special connection made early in life, drop a comment below. It doesn't have to be trains either. Regardless of your reasons for collecting the models, however, the important thing is that they bring you enjoyment or satisfaction in this great hobby of ours.